Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Matt Goodwin. He's a professor of politics at the University of Kent and the author of a new best-selling book, Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. We spoke about what Matt describes as the new elites and their enormous power over British institutions, why no one really wants to be described as a member of the new elite, and why the Conservative Party could yet be overtaken by a new populist right party. As always, you can also find this podcast at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com, where you can find extended episodes, bonus episodes, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. All right, Matt, I should start with congratulations for two things. One is that the book went straight into the Sunday Times bestseller list, so huge congratulations on that front. The other is that you seem to have driven the whole of the British commentariat completely bananas for several weeks, which I think also deserves some congratulations. Could you explain why you've got up their noses so successfully?
Well, the book Values, Voice and Virtue basically argues that what we've got underpinning a lot of the political turmoil in Britain, and I would argue actually across most Western democracies over the last 10 years or so, the vote for Brexit, Trump and so on, is really about this elite graduate class who I call the new elite, just as a sort of descriptor, but basically they tend to come from professional managerial families. They tend to live in the cities, university towns, but crucially, over the last 10 years, they've been drifting very left on cultural questions and identity questions. And so what we've got in Western democracies, I'm arguing, at least in the book, is this education-based polarization between the elite graduate class on one side and a larger graduate class or non-graduates on the other, who on questions relating to things like sex, gender, immigration, borders, are basically moving at different speeds and often in different directions. And so the commentariat in Britain, I think, reacted interestingly to that, because I think they perceive themselves to be the sort of oppressed underdogs who have no power at all, whereas what I'm saying is actually they have enormous cultural, social and political power, which they've been exerting through the institutions which they disproportionately dominate, so media, creative industries, cultural institutions, political parties, House of Commons. And so these cultural debates have really become much sharper because they're imposing this worldview, I would argue a minority worldview, on much of the rest of the country, and that's reflected in the political rebellions that we've been living through, the rise of populism, Brexit in Britain, Boris Johnson in the US, Trump, and elsewhere, where voters have been saying they don't really share that particular set of values, and they also now no longer feel that they have a voice in the institution. So that's essentially the thesis of the book, which has obviously riled up a lot of people who belong to the new elite, who have spent much of the last 2 weeks on Twitter telling me how they don't belong to the new elite and how actually they don't have any power at all. So that's been an interesting experience.
I mean, I say this as a member of the new elite. I'm clearly a member of the new elite, based on every reasonable definition, and a member of the British commentariat. But my view from reading the book was that you're just obviously right. And, the central insight that progressive politics hold sway in an enormous number of powerful institutions seems to me to be obviously true. But then I wonder if, thinking about some of my peers in journalism, I wonder if one of the reasons why they don't necessarily identify themselves in that way, it's partly because they've sort of, part of the function of the politics is to be a representative of the voiceless and the powerless and all these kind of marginalized communities. And so it's hard to see yourself as being a dominant voice when you framed your own sort of moral cause in that way. The other is because they very often don't own property, and find it really hard actually to get on the housing ladder and feel very downwardly socially mobile often. Because if we're talking about people whose parents are also members of the new elite and are in expensive places like London and in prestige occupations that don't necessarily pay that well, like journalism, on the one hand, they have this enormous cultural power, which you outlined correctly. But on the other hand, they often can't even buy a one-bedroom flat. Do you think that might be part of the reason why that kind of self-identification, they're reluctant to see themselves as being elite in any way?
I think it's definitely part of the story. But just in regard to your first point, look, if we look at the actual evidence on the value divides between people who basically, I would argue, dominate the institutions and sort of normal, ordinary voters out there, if you want to say it like that. The evidence on that is overwhelming. I mean, we've got a lot of evidence in the UK that shows, for example, MPs, members of parliament on both the left and the right, lean much further to the cultural left than most voters, including many Conservatives, by the way. So when members of the new elite sort of ran onto Twitter after my book was released and said, but we've got this Conservative government, they sort of completely missed the point that I'm making, which is that actually on both the left and the right of politics now, you have really an elite graduate class that has drifted left on cultural questions. So I don't know, Louise, you might not be in the new elite. I don't know your views inside and out and so on. But and there were always outliers. I mean, there were always outliers, right? But I'm talking about general trends. But the issue about status is a really important one because I think the first thing to say is, I'm by no means the first person to point to this group and say culturally, politically, geographically, and socially, they're in a very different place from many other voters. I mean, you can go through writings in America and Europe and elsewhere, Christopher Lasch, Michael Lind, David Brooks, David Goodhart, Richard Florida, have all in different ways pointed to the group that I'm talking about. So they've talked about a cultural, creative, knowledge class, the Bobos, the bourgeoisie bohemians who basically work in the BBC or the public sector, work in creative industries, advertising, marketing, universities. I would also perhaps include schools, civil service, and they wield this power. But I think where I perhaps depart from some of those other accounts is that I'm also saying that today the notion of status has changed in an important way. And if you go back and you look at, say, the sort of old elite or the earlier elite, the main source of status there was around wealth, was around income, was around leisure time, was around inherited titles. And I think today status is really morphing into being about the embrace of radical progressivism, the embrace of what we might call the sort of diversity complex, woke politics, whatever your favorite term. And I appreciate everybody has different terms. But essentially, the elite graduate class have embraced radical progressivism, partly because they think, they're nice people and they want to make the world a better place. But fundamentally, it's also a status game that they're using the vocabulary that comes with the ideological belief system. They're spending much of their time on social media, signaling that to other people, as we saw this week in the reaction to my book. And they're using this really to try and not only cement their status among the elite, but also disassociate themselves from the morally inferior groups who are maybe supporting Brexit, supporting Donald Trump, maybe haven't gone to elite universities, might be non-graduates, might be working class voters, the bigots, the racists, the gammons, the Karens, etc., etc. And I think that the nature of status has changed. And within journalism, I do think you've hit an important point, because if you actually look at the backgrounds of journalists in Britain and the US, I mean, if you look at books in America like Bad News by Batya Ungasagon, or if you look at similar work by the Reuters Institute at Oxford, they've shown that journalism has become a profession of astonishing privilege over the last half century. It's much more elitist now than it used to be. Local media has collapsed, regional media has collapsed. So there is no sort of working class, non-graduate, ordinary sort of background, ordinary journalists with diverse backgrounds anymore. Often now, particularly in Britain, journalists are going straight from Oxbridge into the newsroom, and senior journalists will tell me often they also view themselves now as activist journalists that are trying to change the world, rather than actually objective journalists who are there to report and search for truth. And I think that's certainly become part of the story. And David Brooks, listening to you, I remember David Brooks talked about this with regard to academics, but he talked about status, this sort of notion of status loss, where they go to hedge funds and banks to give talks, and then go back to their one room apartment and sort of be sort of confronted with the notion that while they thought they were incredibly influential, and they are in many ways influential, they're part of the epistemic class who are deciding what is socially acceptable, what isn't socially acceptable, what norms we use, what norms we don't, what's considered legitimate, what isn't. They would then go back to their apartment and sort of have this crushing sense of actually, well, they're not high status, and that would drive a lot of resentment and envy and anger. And I think partly we've seen some of that we've seen some of that as well. So yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's part of the story.
I think that so much of this is, yes, directed towards, as you say, the gammons, the Karens, the contempt for low, middle, and working class people. I think also there's a lot of intra-elite resentment as well, because you mentioned academics going to hedge funds or whatever. I mean, if you're thinking about cohorts in my generation at Oxford, at Russell Group, Ivy League universities, there's quite a big bifurcation between people who choose to do the prestigious low-paid jobs like academia, like journalism, and the very high-paid jobs like law and finance and so on. And I'm sure that part of the thing that motivates the activist journalists and so on is that feeling that, yes, I'm low status in terms of my earnings, but here's a way in which I can assert my moral status over not just the sort of outgroup in my own nation state, but also literally my peers at university and at school. It's an easy source of emotional solace, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you know the American writer Richard Hananieh has made that very point, that essentially why do more radically progressive, liberal, socially liberal minded people end up dominating the institutions? And in his argument, at least, which I pick up on in the book, is that essentially they prize lower income positions that bring cultural influence, whereas Republicans and conservatives are a bit more pragmatic, shall we say, a bit more, I suppose, instrumental in some sense. They want to go into positions, they want to go into jobs that bring them income, that bring them perhaps greater sense of economic security and so forth. And whereas to make it in media today, to make it in a think tank circuit today, having worked in a number of think tanks over the last 15 years, the reality is, unless you're coming from a family that's already in the managerial professional classes, it's going to be almost impossible for you to really make it in those industries and to have the support. And that's why, if you look at the British media and the profile of journalists today, about 90% now belong to the graduate class. Half of those have graduated from Oxbridge. Only about 38% of the country belong to the graduate class, and only about 7%, no, sorry, only about 1% graduate from Oxbridge, 7% go to private schools. So, this group is really overrepresented, and also in terms of the columnists. And then at the senior level, it becomes even more pronounced. So if you look at things, as I do in the book, BBC managers, senior directors, I had to laugh over the last couple of weeks, seeing many of these people come out and sort of critique my argument in the book, but people who are fitting this exact profile, who have passed through and are now wielding enormous influence. And I think partly they can't see it, and I think to accept it at the end of nearly 13 years of Conservative government as well, after Brexit, these were deeply traumatic events for this particular group that has been moving left in response to those events. I think it's incredibly difficult for them to accept the notion, as you say, that within the elite there are different elites. I mean, I've never said there is not an old conservative pro-business Tory elite. I mean, I talk about that in the book, but I think what I'm saying is that the axis of power now is tilting away from that elite in terms of culture, in terms of society, in terms of politics, and is now rapidly tilting in favor of this new elite, which has simply become much more dominant and influential. And once you step out of Twitter, which is itself dominated by left progressives, they're about 5 times more likely to tweet regularly and to share their political views on social media. Once you step out of that bizarre environment and you look at what is actually happening in out there in the real world, I think that thesis is pretty obvious to everybody who sat watching the adverts on television, watching the political debates, watching the BBC homepage, watching the latest books in the bestseller list, excluding my own, obviously, and some other books that are also wonderful that I've also read on related to this podcast. And generally, this sense that actually the national conversation is now really reflecting a minority set of values, not the values that are held by many other people in the country.
This might be surprising as well to people outside of the UK, but yes, we have had 14 years of Conservative government, but the Conservative Party is by no means a sort of traditionally right-wing party. I mean, there are obviously some socially conservative MPs. for a long time, the dominant strain within the Tory party has been double liberalism, so socially liberal combined with economically liberal. So pro immigration, generally free marketeer, but combined with things like, it was a Conservative government that introduced gay marriage. It was a Conservative government who actually pushed a lot of the trans activist agenda early on before there was a significant backlash. This idea that the Conservatives are sort of holding up some traditional status quo is completely false. The amazing social change actually we've seen in the last 14 years, not just permitted, but actually often encouraged by the Conservative government. I'd say on that point we're quite different from other, say America doesn't seem to quite have that same dynamic where there are still meaningful differences between Republicans and Democrats in a way that I'm not sure that there are between Conservative and Labour parties here.
Maiden Mother Matriarch is brought to you by Keeper, the world's most advanced matchmaking solution. Now, many of you will know that I'm normally extremely suspicious of dating apps like Tinder and Bumble, which tend to produce repeat customers who must endure endless, miserable hookups and short-term relationships without ever finding a spouse. Well, Keeper is a completely different kind of service. Its algorithm prioritizes immediate attraction, but also, crucially, long-term compatibility, because forever is the goal. Everyone in the Keeper matchmaking pool is there because they want to find a spouse. Using psychometric tests like Big Five, IQ, and masculine and feminine polarity, Keeper can accurately predict who you're going to have the strongest chemistry with. The platform only gives you a match if you are an exact fit psychometrically and if the match offers everything that you've told Keeper you're looking for in a partner. It won't waste your time with only good enough matches like other dating apps and matchmaking services will. So, find your Keeper at keeper.ai. That's KEEPER.ai.
And I think that point essentially is the one I'm making, and the response to the book, which is, well, we've had Conservative governments here in Britain since 2010. How can we possibly have a powerful new elite that isn't in power? Well, the answer to that question is look at the Conservative Party and look at the direction of the Conservative Party. And the problem I think that many voters have in Britain is that when they look at the Conservative Party, they increasingly question whether it is what its name implies. Economically, it's much further to the right than many voters would like it to be. Culturally, it's much further to the left than many voters would like it to be. And you can see that even in the aftermath of Brexit. We've had this slightly hysterical, irrational debate about the Conservative Party becoming a hard right, far right party on Twitter and among the sort of progressive class. But actually, if you look at what the Conservative Party has done in power over the last 13 years, it's really embraced, what I talk about in the book as a liberal consensus. I mean, essentially, I think there have been sort of three stages to this revolution from Thatcher onwards. Thatcher brought about a radical economic liberalism, which was about liberalizing the economy, deregulating finance, and essentially putting London on steroids. And that model of hyper-globalization really, on one level, it did make the country richer, but it also made it much more unequal. And if you look at the evidence on the effects of Thatcherism, that's now crystal clear. Economists now share a broad consensus that the effects of hyperglobalization were very negative for workers and non-graduates. If you then fast forward to the Blair years, well, Blair and Brown essentially embraced Thatcher's economic legacy. Okay, they tinkered around the edges when it came to families and pensioners and Sure Start and things like that, but essentially they embraced the fundamentals of Thatcher's radical economic liberalism, but they added to that a radical cultural liberalism. They added to that a broad and sweeping commitment to mass immigration, to what I would argue was the continued weakening of the cultural guardrails in society, a sort of loose universal commitment to these abstract ideas of diversity and multiculturalism, and essentially Britishness became reframed around these very universal international themes, which left lots of voters thinking, well, what is happening to Britain's distinctive identity, culture, and history. And alongside that, we had the Equalities Act, Human Rights Act. We had a whole, what I would argue is the stage was essentially set for the onward march of radical progressivism. And then when David Cameron, the Liberal Conservative, eventually replaced New Labour, he essentially accepted all of it. He accepted the Thatcherite economic legacy. He accepted the New Labour cultural legacy. He put the pedal down actually on much of that. I mean, David Cameron and George Osborne described themselves as progressive conservatives with a straight face. So this was really the next chapter in the liberal consensus. And even when we got to Brexit, and that's why I think Brexit happened in this country. Very similar reasons in some senses in America with Trump, but many voters were just looking at this liberal consensus, which really only represented the values of about 20% of the country maximum. And I think voters looked at it and said, you know what, I don't want a pro-EU, pro-globalization, pro-immigration, pro-radical progressivism, pro-middle class consensus. I want something different in this country. And that essentially is what the vote for Brexit, in my mind at least, and I think the evidence supports me, was all about. But in the aftermath of Brexit, we had a Conservative Party that, because of where it's come from, it was completely unable to meet voters on that. So what happens? Immigration goes even higher, goes up to a net migration level of 504,000. The party does not actually push back on any of the big changes introduced by New Labour. If you look at the Conservatives today, they won't go anywhere near things like the Equality Act. They won't go anywhere near things like removing the country from the European Convention on Human Rights in order to deal with issues like the small boats that are crossing the Channel. The Conservatives just have essentially accepted the liberal lodestar and won't challenge any of it. So on all of these social and cultural questions, I think basically what we've got are sort of chinos, Conservatives in name only, and they're not really satisfying the appetite that's out there. So when you look at the issues that you talk about in this podcast, when you look at, say, for example, what we're teaching kids about, sex and gender, among other issues, I mean, the Conservatives are deeply hesitant to get involved in that because they're, I would argue, status-obsessed Tories. They view cultural questions as being beneath them. They're fundamentally about business, tax, and the economy. And they've not yet realized what I think the US Republicans have, what the Italian Conservatives have, what the Swedish Conservatives and the French Conservatives have, which is that people want a very different brand of conservatism now. They don't want this kind of race to the bottom, economically and socially liberal brand of conservatism, which isn't really that different from social democracy. So it's going to be interesting to see where the Conservatives go. But that's my essential assessment of how the party came really unstuck and why it's still, even today, in a very vulnerable position.
Yes, you end up with this slightly paradoxical thing where the Conservatives, or some of them, do recognise what they read polls too. They do know what the public thinks. So you end up with, for instance, quite tough talk on things like small boats. So this is illegal immigration across the Channel from France. All sorts of promises to crack down on it, which of course invite from the neo-elites, as you describe them. They have kittens about this kind of tough talk from the Home Secretary. But this, as you say, it's combined with 504,000 net migration last year. I mean, the idea that the Conservative Party is anti-immigration is for the birds. I mean, they've invited historically unprecedented levels of net migration into the country. I think that what they're trying to do, I'd say with limited success, is signal to voters who are unhappy about that level of mass migration that they are willing to talk tough, etc., but not actually do it. And I don't think that smoke and mirrors exercise is working. I think, Brexit showed us that people are definitely dissatisfied with what they see happening. And I mean, the question, I suppose, for you as a political scientist is, why hasn't there been a party that has successfully, or a faction within the Conservatives that has successfully offered the sort of economically left, socially right combination that voters apparently are desperate for?
Well, the short answer to that is a majoritarian first past the post system, and it imposes such a formidably high barrier to entry for any new party. And similar in America, where new parties, independent parties, are almost doomed from the very start. The classic case of that was the UK Independence Party in 2015, which polled nearly 13% of the vote and won just one seat in the House of Commons. So that's why many of the people who desire reform and change in Britain now will be calling for proportional representation and a change in the election system. So that only really leaves one possible alternative, which is to change what you might call the dominant faction within one of the governing parties. And there are Conservatives who now say that actually the only way of meeting voters on these issues is to try and change the dominant faction within the Conservatives. But that's where you run up against what you might call the old elite in British politics. I mean, the donor class, the upper echelons of the Conservative Party, CCHQ, the party headquarters, are basically dominated by old elites who don't really have much of an interest in reforming the country on that basis. They have a very vested interest in sustaining very high rates of inward migration, largely to support business and to support a pretty hollowed out economic model that we have that's simply based on consumption and cheap labor. And that was perhaps best symbolized by Boris Johnson, who basically, I would argue, sort of gaslit the entire country and convincing them into thinking he was a conservative, when actually what happened was the complete opposite. I mean, most people who even like Boris Johnson aren't aware of what he even did when he was in power, such as removing a requirement on British businesses to advertise jobs in Britain. I mean, that was like the sort of, base level, most conservative thing probably you could do. And then he got rid of that. And then they lowered salary thresholds so that people could come and work in the country on as low wage as £23,000 a year, in some cases £20,000 a year. The average wage is £27,000. So the idea that this is a high skill migration policy that's geared towards improving Britain's economy and so on is for the birds. I mean, basically what we have is the continuation of what we had pre-2016, which is why I talk about the new elite and this liberal consensus. It hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, essentially we're out of the EU, but socially, culturally, the fabric of our society is still fundamentally wedded to it, and a lot of voters haven't realized that. A lot of politicians have no serious interest in changing that. If you look, for example, at the Scotland issue recently, where we had the Scottish National Party campaigning for the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which would essentially make it legal for 16-year-olds to quote unquote change their gender without any medical supervision after a very short period of time and so on. Even Conservatives who oppose that piece of legislation, which by the way 80% of voters also oppose that idea, Conservatives opposed it from the position of defending the Equalities Act. So they said, well, this piece of legislation, if it's enacted, is going to conflict with UK-wide equalities legislation brought in by New Labour. There wasn't even a Conservative critique of that policy. So that, in a sense, is a good example of what I'm arguing in the book, which is essentially the sort of new elite and cultural drift is so profound now, is so visible, that even the governing Conservative Party can't really do anything but go along with it. It certainly can't challenge it. It certainly can't overturn it. And that's something that I think many voters are slowly but steadily realizing. And I don't think the big winner of all of this, because of our system, will be populism. I think a big winner in all of this will be apathy. I think a lot of people who have taken a punt over the last 10 years in voting for a different politician or a different type of politics will probably now come to the conclusion that actually it's impossible to change a system, and they're just going to sit it out and stay at home. So I suspect apathy will end up being the big winner.
Do you not think that there might be... So if, as is predicted, the Conservatives lose the next election, some people are predicting or hoping that there might be a sort of regrouping in opposition. I mean, at the last leadership election, if the Tory members had their say, we'd probably now have Kemi Badenoch as Prime Minister. She, for those who don't know, she's a sort of very anti-woke figure, enormously popular in much of the media and among the Tory membership. Also British Nigerian woman, extremely, is still young, very capable, very, well regarded among many people in politics and elsewhere. But she was not able to make it into the final two, because it was actually the parliamentary party that blocked her. If the members had their way, we would have had a much more culturally right executive than we do now. Is it possible that actually the parliamentary party might realise in opposition that they need to be more attentive to what voters actually think?
Possibly, but I think the underlying issue is whether, and this is a global question for conservatives, really, what is conservatism in the early 2020s? And I think fundamentally, the Conservative Party is not going to be able to answer that question through one leader. I think they have to really go on a search to try and figure out what kind of party they are and what kind of party they want to be. Kemi Badenoch certainly got some really good answers to that question. I think she's roughly in the right place culturally. Whether she is economically, I think, is another question for another day. But if you look at conservatives around the globe, the ones who have realised the direction of travel, who are, I think, finally coming to the conclusion they're going to need to change their relationship with the state. They're going to need to use the organs of the state to try and balance the playing field a little bit. They're going to have a very different view on things like migration and the pace of demographic change. They're going to have to reassert, their values in a more vigorous way. They're going to have to start outlining a serious defense of things like the family and the traditional cultural guardrails in society. They're going to have to speak very openly and directly about big tech and the challenges that it faces, and also China. And I think if you compare and contrast people like, say Giorgia Meloni, Ron DeSantis, sort of Peter Thiel, conservatives outside of Britain, whether you agree with them, whether you disagree with them, they are all saying far more interesting things than British Tories. Like, British Tories are lost. I mean, they're sort of, they're divided between people who want to rewind the clock to 1987 and bring back, a sort of modern day version of Nigel Lawson's budget. Or they're sort of, kind of dreaming of going back to, the pre-Brexit era where, they thought everything was good. Or they want to run back to their core territory in, the southeast Tory shires, which we saw during the Levelling Up debate, which is the idea that the Conservatives in government need to invest in areas like our Rust Belt or the Red Wall. And the Conservatives never really fully reconciled themselves to that. They never kind of understood the importance of that because they're primarily a sort of southern party. And I think that for all of those reasons, actually, it's not just about who can lead the party, who could go up against the party's donor class, which will be another big challenge. But what is the British Conservative Party today? And, a colleague of mine, Andrew Gamble, has long argued that the reason the Conservatives have been the most successful party in pretty much a history of democracy is because they've always reinvented themselves at different points in history. And I think ultimately, the Conservatives now will need to reinvent themselves if they're going to somehow stay around for the longer term. Yes, the system makes it hard for a new party to break through. It's not completely impossible. As the Labour Party will tell you, the Labour Party replaced the Liberals, and as the Canadians will tell you, the Conservative Party in Canada in the early 90s was replaced. I mean, it's not completely implausible, difficult, but not implausible. So hopefully we'll have a more interesting debate next year about what is conservatism, and we will have in the US and the UK these two enormous elections where we will have two very different brands of conservative politics going into those elections with very different policy offers. And on the one hand, you've got the Republicans who have actually agreed to make woke or anti-woke, anti-progressivism a central plank of their presidential campaign. And on the other hand, you have the British Tories who just won't go near any of those issues. They're incredibly hesitant to go near those issues. So seeing how those elections turn out, I think, is also going to be pretty interesting. So we'll see.
I think an enormous barrier for British Conservatives in talking about these cultural war topics, which we know are very important among much of the public, is at its low status, right? Like if you come from the new elite, you socialise with them, you live in London, you have this very telling bit in your book where you talk about Labour MP giving a speech in her constituency in Yorkshire and waxing lyrical about the sort of local waterfalls or whatever, to completely dumbfounding the audience because they don't have any waterfalls in there. Because basically she's never visited her constituency. She knew nothing about her constituency and went to Oxford and, was basically parachuted in and spent all her time in London. It's very, very common for Conservative MPs to basically only socialise among the new elite and to care about their social status in those circles. in order to talk about things like, I don't know, I mean, it's still a majority of the public who favour reintroducing capital punishment. Very hard to find even Conservative MPs who'll talk publicly about that, and to do so at most, London dinner tables is really risking your reputation. But I guess if they're going to actually trying to capture this new moment, they have to suck it up.
Well, I mean, if you look at the reaction, we had a new deputy leader of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, who suggested that we should bring back the death penalty for some crimes because it had a 100% success rate. And, sort of Westminster was in meltdown about this. And you look at the polling, and typically it's between about 40-50% will say bring back capital punishment. But then if you ask with regards to, say, killing police officers, killing children, it's up to about 70-80%. On a whole suite of other issues as well. I mean, if you take, and I've been polling them recently, if you take what I would call radical progressive positions, let's rename pregnant women pregnant persons, let's allow children to change their gender, let's have puberty blockers being introduced and being taught to children in school, all of this sort of stuff. I mean, this is typically 5-10% support max. I mean, these are fringe minority issues. Now, people say, well, voters don't care about those issues. Well, my response to that is twofold. One is look at Brexit. Nobody really, if you look at the polling ahead of Brexit, nobody really cared that much about Britain's relationship with Europe. It was a 5% issue in the polling. And then when it became a national issue, because some politicians, I would argue were brave enough to talk about it and make it an issue, then actually everybody suddenly tuned in and started to discuss that. The other example is America. If you look at America and you look at the debate over schooling and what is being taught to children and how they're being taught about these issues, 5 years ago, it was a non-issue. Now it's, a top 3 issue in the country. It's going to be all over the presidential campaign next year. So, if you want to drive the salience of issues, it is often about the supply side. It's about finding political, civic, cultural figures who are brave enough to actually raise the volume, increase the volume on those debates. And once that happens, voters begin to tune in, as they did in Scotland. When voters really looked at the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, the vast majority of them said, this is crazy, I don't support this, and I don't think we should be doing this to kids or allowing this to happen. But what you often find, and I talk a lot about this in the book, with radical progressives, is about, they represent only about 15% of the country, but because they're very vocal, they're very prominent on social media, and they're also deeply intolerant of anybody who expresses a different view of their own or who challenges what they consider to be sacred values. Often the moderates in the room are basically silenced or stigmatized, as being socially unacceptable or as having a discredited voice. Now, on a whole range of issues, from immigration to Western nations being racist, to what we should teach kids, to how we think about our history, the view of radical progressives is often the view of a 10 to 15% minority. And very few people are aware of that. So they feel sort of quite scared and quite sort of, intimidated. Another example would be take the Gary Lineker posturing that we had in Britain, a very famous footballer who was very, very strongly opposed to the government's plan to essentially immediately deport asylum seekers and illegal migrants who are crossing the channel in small boats. He said this is absolutely outrageous. He essentially compared it to Nazi Germany, and everybody in the progressive class on Twitter said, wonderful Gary Lineker, I completely share this view, as does much of the country. Now, if you watch that conversation, you might think half the country share Gary Lineker's view. It's a 16% position. Only 16% of people strongly opposed what the government was trying to do. Most people in the country want strong and controlled borders. Most people in the country do not want illegal migration to become a feature of their national life. And most people certainly don't want to be paying £6 million a day to put those people into hotels. Now, this might strike the progressive class as being sort of unsavory and low status, but this is a reality of public opinion. This is a reality of how people live their lives. They're proud of their country. They want to think well of their country. They don't want to obsess or be told why their identity is a source of shame and embarrassment, and they want to be able to control who comes into their home and who leaves. And I think ultimately that's where I think our politicians have come unstuck, and much of the new elite who dominate the cultural conversation have come unstuck.
One of the a view that you'll quite often hear among journalists who are member of this sort of radical progressive 15%, which is to say probably most journalists. Although I should say that actually British media is one of those institutions that hasn't been fully captured by progressives, in that you still do have quite a lot of right-wing newspapers, including the one that I work for, Daily Mail. And I guess that's probably because it's sensitive to sales. I mean, I really do think one of the reasons that the BBC is able to has been captured so successfully is because the BBC doesn't need to sell itself. It's dependent on the license fee. So it doesn't matter if they're promoting ideas that are unpopular with the public, because they don't need the public to purchase their product. Whereas with newspapers, you depend on sales. You know, the reason the Daily Mail takes socially conservative positions is because it's the best read newspaper in the country, and socially conservative positions are popular. But anyway, a lot of journalists are very progressive, and one of the views that you'll hear on the culture war is basically, why do you care? Why are you making this into an issue? Why are you obsessed with trans? Why are you obsessed with small boats? Why are you why are conservatives sort of conjuring these issues out of thin air and trying to rile people up over what is basically trivia? To which I say, no, hang on. Like, whether or not you want to disagree with them, the conservative side are just defending the status quo. They are opposing very, very rapid social change. Something like, if you identify as a man or a woman, then you are magically a man or a woman immediately. That is an extremely non-commonsensical view that has suddenly been launched at people and it has been enshrined in law. I don't think that it is waging culture war for people to want to say, hang on, which if you look at the polling is basically what people think. Like genuine transphobia is rare. What is common is for people to be cautious and concerned. And as you mentioned Scotland, what's really striking if you look at the Scottish polling is that people didn't really care that much or have much of an opinion really on the Gender Recognition Act up until the SNP started pushing for more radical reforms. And then all of a sudden people learned that this was an issue, became more knowledgeable about it, and thought, hold on, this is it.
Absolutely. And you can look at, say, for example, ask mums and dads up and down the country, do you think parents should have a right to see what their kids are being taught about these issues in school? I've asked them this many times. About 75-80% say absolutely. Now, what's happening is the government is sort of inching towards that position. It said it's going to do a review of what organisations are being brought in to teach kids about these issues. Miriam Cates, who's a Conservative MP here in Britain, one of the most impressive and intellectually serious politicians in Westminster, has been campaigning on this issue, revealing what is happening in primary and secondary schools up and down the country. And, we go through this bizarro loop where progressives will say, well, nothing's happening. And then you'll end up having, a big dollop of evidence put on the table. And then they'll say, that's nothing. Don't worry. Why are you such a racist? Why are you such a transphobe for worrying about this? So we go through this ridiculous loop all the time. But it speaks to the failure of the Conservatives, Louise, because what Conservatives have essentially allowed to happen over the last 20 years is they've allowed a large array of issues, their core issues, family, national identity, national history, national borders, who we are, to be rebadged, reframed as culture wars, and to be considered toxic and socially unacceptable. That even if you talk about these issues now, if you talk about our history, if you talk about women's rights, if you talk about the rights of children, you are engaging in divisive culture war politics. It's a very, very subtle and shrewd strategy typically pursued by radical progressives. But Conservatives have basically vacated territory. They've retreated and allowed all of this to happen. And because they consider these issues to be low status and they won't go near them, unlike their American equivalents who have basically, said, actually, we're up for this fight. And I don't agree with Donald Trump, but I certainly have sympathy for the view that if you want to have an intellectual and a political battle over these issues to do with women, children, and family, we're going to have that battle. British Tories won't go near it, right? They view this as being, you know, toxic, stigmatizing, divisive, and I think that partly is a reflection of the power of what I call the new elite and the liberal consensus, that it's basically now captured almost all of the political parties, and that's reflected in the state of our national conversation.
What's amazing is actually that Miriam Cates got through Tory party selection, because actually that's the institution, the crucial institution that is pushing the Conservatives in this towards this liberal drift, and that it's just really hard to actually get selected as an MP if you don't hold to basically Cameron era social and economic positions.
This is why I think the Conservative Party is still deeply vulnerable. I mean, I really do think if you had a strong voice outside of the Conservative Party, you know, and there is a view that's pushed by some figures, Peter Hitchens being the most obvious example, which is that there is absolutely no way of reform. You can never reform the Conservative Party. It's simply a blockage to any interesting, meaningful reform. You know, I do think the Conservatives philosophically, politically, culturally are very vulnerable, even now. I just simply think over the next 10 years, both the scale and the pace of change, which is going to be enormous in Britain, like it will be in many other Western democracies, is going to knock voters sideways. Because I sit in focus groups with them all the time. Most voters have not yet twigged what's happened in terms of the changes that have been introduced into the country, and I think that is going to drive a lot of public concern, and I don't think the Conservatives will be able to supply that with a serious message. So I do think structurally they're very vulnerable. If you look at the parties which are thriving, you know, if you take Meloni as an example in Italy, and she says this openly, she's a Scrutonian conservative. You know, she is essentially driving an argument that is very different from the Cameroon Thatcherite conservative argument in Britain. She's very, very focused on the promotion of national preference, national sovereignty, you know, and national conservatism. And I think this emerging debate about national conservatism, what is it, and how is it different from a more liberal conservatism, is probably going to be the debate in Britain over the next 3 to 5 years. I think it's going to be one of the big talking points, because it is probably the only thing that can hold together this new electoral coalition that the party now has. I mean, working class, non-graduate, older, pensioners, small towns, coastal cities, culturally conservative on all the issues that we've been talking about, from immigration through to issues like you know, sex and gender and so forth. And I think that's going to be probably the only framework that will allow the party to get through, because there's no way London and university towns are going to vote Conservative anytime soon. I mean, those areas are gone. I mean, they're gone for a long time. As the graduate class continues to drift leftwards on all of these cultural questions, the great awakening that's unfolding is a very real thing. And, you know, I think it will increasingly push these educational groups in very different directions, and also women and men to some extent. I think if you look at young university educated women under the age of 20, 25, 26, they're much further to the left culturally and politically than their male counterparts, and they're sort of drifting apart rapidly. And there's a sort of known unknown, which is, well, is this going to be a blip, or is this actually a sort of permanent realignment that seems to be taking place around these cultural questions?
And that's true elsewhere as well, isn't it? And am I right that in America there wasn't much of a sex skew up until relatively recently, and now there's an enormous sex skew, particularly when it comes to unmarried graduate women are so strongly blue in America?
Yeah, there's been quite some really interesting work on that over the last five months or so, and they've essentially moved sharply to the left. British university educated women as well, typically about 85% are now voting for liberal left parties, whether Labour, Green, SNP, Lib Dem. So we're seeing something similar, and that sort of raises all kinds of questions about the future. I mean, there are some outliers that are interesting. I mean, if you look at France, for example, young non-graduate women in the hospitality sector have been overwhelmingly supportive of Marine Le Pen at recent elections. You know, they've really gone in a very different direction, and there's a sort of debate about why that is. Is it the educational effect that graduate women are being pushed leftwards? Non-graduate women in France are moving a bit to the right. Is it Le Pen herself? You know, she sort of portrays a particular vision of what being a woman is all about, and or is it simply that some of the trends that have been unfolding in America and Britain have not been unfolding to the same extent in other European societies? You know, we'll have to see, but I think it's one of these things that's going to have pretty big implications, especially looking at the men young non-graduate men who I think, you know, will increasingly find themselves, you know, politically and culturally in a very different place, you know, less successful in the education system, politically much further to the right, often not living in the cities or university towns, you know, may end up feeling quite resentful of some of that change. And I think we don't know where that's going to go, but I think it's something that we can see in the data that's very visible, and it'll be interesting to watch it unfold.
And what's really striking to me is that this is a new phenomenon. You know, men and women historically have not actually voted all that differently. And maybe this also has something to do with people, just there being greater polarization between the sexes on all sorts of things, and people not forming long-term relationships in the way that they used to, and just a general fracturing of kind of sexual relations, which seems to be bearing out in the polls. Yeah, I mean, so do you think that there's a good chance that the Conservative Party could be overtaken by a populist right party that actually could surmount the first past the post obstacle and really make gains within the next decade or so?
I think one of the most interesting things happening right now in Britain and America is maybe outside the realm of party politics, but is the beginning of a very distinctive ecosystem. And I think it's about the rivers or the sea in which political parties are swimming. And I think if you look at the rise of, you know, YouTube, Substack, you know, for the first time really in modern history, we have an intellectual class that is not dependent upon the institutions or indeed, you know, political parties or universities in terms of getting their ideas out there. And I think that ecosystem, you can see, for example, in Britain, is very visible. It's becoming in many respects, it's where all of the interesting ideas are. You know, I think there are two things that are true at the same time. The first is most of the interesting ideas right now are on the right, and most of them are outside the legacy institutions. And I think that is one of the interesting points of where we are in the intellectual cycle. So there is a question about whether those ideas can sort of begin to bleed into the major parties, can begin to change the national culture. As I say, you know, the majoritarian system itself is a nightmare to try and overcome. But it seems to me that compared to where we were, say, 5 years ago, intellectually, I'm a bit more optimistic. I sort of think we're in a much more interesting place at the moment. You know, there are vehicles, magazines, websites, think tanks, and so on that are presenting a very different view, and an alternative to a liberal consensus. And I think that has also got a sense of coherency and structure to it. You know, that I think probably many people listening to this podcast and other podcasts can sense that actually there is a vibrant ecosystem in place, and that may be actually what becomes a first step in trying to create some kind of alternative to what is clearly not working. When I look at the left of politics at the moment, I don't really see any new ideas at all. I mean, if you look at, say, the Labour Party in the UK, the Democrats, I mean, obviously with the exception of radical progressivism, which is kind of, you know, not intellectually that new, but is also in the process, I think, of eating itself in many ways. But there's not much new, and I think that's going to also create a lot of interesting debates and discussions in the years ahead.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think the right is intellectually much more interesting at the moment, if only because it's sort of fresh. I mean, I think the nature of being the dominant ideology, which, as you identify, I think progressivism is, at least within elite circles, is you can rest on your laurels and become very sort of stagnant, I think, intellectually. So yes, you're seeing a lot of fresh new media outlets and voices and so on from the right, which are so much more stimulating, I think.
And it's easier to be in oppositional mode as a political movement or as an intellectual movement. It's always easier to be in an oppositional mode. So, even if you end up with Democrats winning again next year and the Labour Party taking power in Britain, I think a lot of the YouTube channels, television channels, podcasts, and others that we end up talking about will simply drift into oppositional mode, and it will probably end up becoming even more interesting. So I'm not sort of worried about on the level of ideas. It's more the system and how you can try and navigate an election system that is fundamentally wired against new entrants, and that's that's one of the big problems that all first past the post systems have. But yeah, we'll see.
Is this drift politically towards progressivism likely to become more entrenched by societal aging and the fact that you have the traditional ideas still, to the extent that there is still a sort of old elite who still have some power and still hold traditional ideas, they tend to be older. Whereas, as you say, 85% of young graduate women are voting left. And I'd say that in some elite circles that you're talking 99%. As that generation, my generation and younger, become the dominant generation in positions of influence within their institutions, I guess, this could only become more exaggerated, this gulf between the elite and the rest of the population.
I think that's definitely possible and plausible. If you look at the data, there's a bit of a debate about, are we on the cusp of actually a sweeping political and cultural revolution that is going to define the next half century, or are we seeing something of a generational blip that may prove to be more short term? My gut instinct and reading of the evidence is, what we're living through is the beginning of a long-term sustained political and cultural revolution that will continue to accelerate. And I think the data is pretty clear at the extent to which many of these ideas are supported by new generations, and also as the graduate class continues to expand. I think that will also feed into it. And in some sense, politics as well. If you look at, say, white university educated liberals in America, one of the remarkable things that happened after Trump is, they sort of doubled down on their progressivism and social liberalism and became even more committed to many of their ideas. So you saw sort of a counter revolution to Trump. And so even if you get a pushback, politically, I think there's a kind of ratchet effect that comes with liberalism and progressivism, where it sort of just continues to escalate, and they sort of continue to search for the sort of utopia. And if that continues, then there are going to be strange and unpredictable ruptions along the way. If you look, for example, at Latino and Hispanic voters in the US who are rapidly moving from left to right, partly in response to things like defund the police and some of the radical policies on gender and stuff like that, which clearly clash with their more socially, culturally conservative values. There will be strange configurations in politics to come, in the same way that I don't think in Britain many British Muslims, Sikhs and Hindus are comfortable with what's happening in school, and are comfortable with the way in which social liberalism sort of erodes the cultural guardrails that many of those voters as well care a great deal about: national identity, religion, and so on. So I think that there are going to be some strange and unpredictable shifts along the way, but it's difficult to see how, now that this is out of the box, how it goes back in. I think the institutions are invested in keeping it going. I think the the sort of parents and the professional managerial classes are clearly sort of invested, and I think the Gen Z if you look at all of the attitudinal data and where they sit on issues like free speech, gender, migration, net zero, I mean, they're pretty on board. There are always outliers. I teach in Kent, in the southeast of England, which is a pretty conservative part of the country, and most of my students are Gen Z, and a lot of them will say they've got deep reservations about woke politics, and they feel that they're very instinctively conservative on a lot of issues. So there are outliers, about 1 in 5, but the dominant faction is very progressive on a lot of these issues, especially in the elite institutions, where, as this takes on a completely different life form and becomes a sort of the epicenter of the new religion.
So in the extended bit of the episode, I want to talk more about the role of meritocracy in all of this and the sort of self-segregation of the elite. But one last question before we do. I'm sure you've heard the comparison that plenty of other people have come up with between our own era of political disruption and the Reformation. And, like in the Reformation, it was the Protestantism was, at least in the UK, primarily driven by young and very, very kind of fervent reformers against an old Catholic elite. And, of course, fortunately, the comparison falls down in the sense that so far ours has been bloodless. We're basically talking about a cold civil war, both here and in the UK. But I think the comparison is a very pertinent one, because we are talking about sort of enormously different worldviews and sets of values. And, given if history is a template, that probably does suggest that there might be some sort of counter Reformation in the works. Do you see that kind of opposition brewing with time? This seems to be I think that this is an enormous historical event, and I think that really what's going on, like the big event of our lifetimes and beyond, is actually de-Christianization. Like, what we're going through is the effect of Christendom withdrawing, and now we have these two factions kind of fighting over ideological dominance. I expect that this will last for my entire lifetime. Do you think, though, that there will be do you expect the woke side to triumph, essentially, in the end?
I think it's all going to come down to leadership, and whether we have political movements and figures who are willing to lead that kind of counter-revolution. I think if you really boil the leaders of the kind of woke revolution down to numbers, you're looking at 15% max, around that figure. But the moderates are very scared to engage with them and are very scared to challenge them on a lot of issues. So unless we can find somebody or something that's capable of inspiring moderate masses to actually push back against some of this, then the minority radical activists will end up dominating the public square, as I'd argue they're doing now, and they will remove dissent, and they will discredit dissent, and they will try and cancel and silence people who they consider to be betraying the revolution. And I think history gives us lots of insight. I mean, more recent experience I would point to is just the experience of communism and communist regimes, and just how much they work to silence and discredit challengers. And that essentially, I think, is something that we're seeing in a very similar way. I mean, I just finished reading The Constitution of Knowledge, that Jonathan, I can't remember the author now, but talked about the epistemic class, the way in which essentially when a society's epistemic class is completely dominated by one group, I mean, everything then flows from that: social norms, law, culture, ways of life, and it all starts to become reshaped. And I think that, we are living through something like that. So, and I agree with you on Christendom. I think essentially the grand narratives and the grand meaning, or the story about who we are, has become so loss, that it's created an enormous vacuum, which radical progressivism, with its promise of a utopia, with its promise of salvation, with its emphasis on activism, on recognition, on victimhood, I think offers people, especially more fragile people, even more narcissistic people, a very clear narrative that they can subscribe to. And so, again, what's the alternative? What's the counter narrative to that? And whenever people say counter narrative, I always begin to get suspicious, because it sounds so abstract and so vague. I mean, you hear people in the sort of on the kind of anti-woke right talking about building a new story for the West, but what does that really mean? And I think a far more practical way forward is thinking about actually how non-anti-woke people can actually start to reclaim parts of the state and start to use parts of the state to balance the playing field. Narratives and stories to me sound so vague that unless you've got your hands on the instruments of power, I think that stuff is more theoretical than anything. So I mean, I'm skeptical of where we're going, but I agree with you. I think we are on the cusp of something that's going to last certainly for decades, and will come to be seen as a cultural revolution. It will come to be seen as something that is fundamentally sweeping and transformative. I think we're at the beginning of that, and the 2010s will come to be seen, I think, as a very pivotal decade in the beginning of that.
All right, thank you so much, Matt. I'm going to wrap it up here for free subscribers. Could you let everyone know where they can buy your book, and where they can find more of your work?
Well, Values, Voice and Virtue came out about 10 days ago, so you'll find it on Amazon and Waterstones and elsewhere, and on Twitter you'll find me debating with the new elite about why.
Debating, yeah.
Well, they don't want to have a debate. That's the thing. I mean, that's the other thing about this group. They're the evidence shows they're the most likely to unfriend, block, and harass people who hold political beliefs that they disagree with, or who speak on behalf of people who might hold beliefs they disagree with. So that's also been another confirmation of the thesis over the last 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much for watching that episode of Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, and for all of your support. It means an enormous amount for the growth of the show. If you want to hear bonus content, an extra 20, 30 minutes of conversation with the guest, maybe a little bit more personal, a little bit less filtered, then you can go to my Substack at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can sign up for extended episodes and also bonus episodes, and you can also access our chat community. You can also support the show by subscribing on YouTube or subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, and rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts is also really great for encouraging other people to give the show a try. Please also spread the word, tell people that you know who you think might like it to give it a shot. The word of mouth effect is really valuable, so we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, watching, and supporting what we're doing.